Welcome back to the Compass Podcast, where we invest in drawing out the divine moments in our daily lives. This is a stormy edition of Compass as I'm recording this portion during a thunderstorm. So if you hear some extra audio, it's because things are a little bit nuts outside right now. Many of us, though, we like thunderstorms, so long as we can have a safe place to ride them out, right? They're awe-inspiring, which serendipitously is kind of what this episode of Compass is about. That is, being inspired by awe and recapturing a view of the world that allows for some mysticism and mystery. In this episode, I talked with Dr. Richard Beck about interrupting our skepticism and rediscovering the enchantment in Christian traditions. We'll start with talking about Celtic legends, even some cryptozoology, but then get into addressing the deep ache that so many of us feel about connecting with something greater. We discussed connecting with younger generations, existential restlessness, and embodying moral beauty. It's a deep episode. If you appreciate the value that our show Compass brings to your day, we'd be incredibly grateful if you could take a moment to leave us a rating and review. Your feedback not only helps us improve the show, but it also makes a huge difference in helping more listeners like you find us, the Compass Podcast. So here's how you can leave a rating and review. On Apple Podcasts, open the Apple Podcasts app on your phone or computer, search for Compass, finding spirituality in the everyday, and then scroll down to the ratings and reviews section. Tap the stars to rate the podcast. You can hit the 5-star. Go ahead. If you have a moment, write a few words about what you enjoy about the show in the review section. On Spotify, you launch the Spotify app on your mobile device. You head to our podcast page. Below the podcast title, you'll see a rating section represented by stars. So tap to rate us. Although Spotify doesn't support written reviews yet, those stars really do count. And on YouTube, you head over to our YouTube page, find our channel, Compass Podcast, Finding Spirituality in the Everyday. We have our own channel there. After watching an episode, hit the like button to show your support, and then leave a comment to tell us and other viewers what you thought. Your comments help increase our visibility on YouTube, and they grow our community. And of course, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon so you don't miss when we throw new stuff out there. All right, back to this episode. We're talking with Dr. Richard Beck, who is a professor of psychology at Abilene Christian University. He's the author of the popular blog Experimental Theology, the thoughts, articles, and essays of Richard Beck. His latest book is called Hunting Magic Eels, Enchanted Faith in a Skeptical Age. That's where the cryptozoology comes from. That book is out right now. As an experimental psychologist and a practicing Christian, Richard attempts to integrate theology with experimental social sciences. Really makes for some interesting stuff. So I had a great time talking with Dr. Richard Beck. I think you'll appreciate the conversation too. So let's get to it. Well, we're going to get into some deep topics, talking about finding meaning in life and ideas of around faith and enchantment. But I have to ask you first, what happened to the Magic Eels?
Yeah, so the title of my latest book is called Hunting for Magic Eels, and so everybody thinks it's a book about like cryptozoology, like
that's
chapters
what drew me in, honestly.
Yeah, chapters on like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, and so my publisher picked the title, and I had some reservations about that. I'm like, people are not going to know what this is. Could you imagine just going through the Christian Living section and seeing Hunting for Magic Eels?
It piques interest, though.
Yeah. And but the subtitle is Recovering an Enchanted Faith in a Skeptical Age. But the title came from my wife and I were in Wales. We were on Sandwin Island, where there was a Celtic saint, Saint Dwynwen. She's the Saint Valentine's of the Welsh people. And she became the patron saint of lovers because on her island there was this water well that had these enchanted eels in it. And the legend was if you threw a token of your love into the well and the eels came up and disturbed it, that would be a sign that they would be faithful through life. So this was premarital counseling in the Middle Ages, And so all these pilgrimages came to the water well, and she became the patron saint of lovers. And so I tell the story, my wife and I were on the island looking for this well and the magical eels. But I then quickly pivot to say, we couldn't find the well. But that's not our world anymore. Like, we don't see premarital counseling from Magical Eels. And so what has happened in the modern era, where we're seeing the rise of unbelief, increasing disaffiliation from our churches? What has happened over the 500 years when you go from that world, very enchanted, miraculous, supernatural, to our world where faith is a little more fragile and hard to come by?
Yeah. It's funny you bring up the cryptozoology. A couple years ago, I started a fascination with things like cryptozoology and kind of the tales of lore and spiritual, supernatural, and was listening to a lot of podcasts at the time. I still do, actually. And my wife at the time was like, what is this fascination? What has brought this on? And I couldn't explain it very well, except to say that I loved the idea that there was still something unknown about our world, a sense of fascination that, behind the rocks might be something unthought of, something mysterious, and maybe, as you would term it, something enchanted. What do you think we're missing when we lose this sense of enchantment with the world?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would just describe for your listeners is just why grab the word enchantment. I know some, especially kind of conservative or traditional Christians, just really don't like that word, don't like me throwing the word magical around. But the reason why I like the word enchantment is it does focus on an experiential perspective. And I think that's helpful, because I think a lot of people, like if you talk to people in the pews, pastors, church leaders, and said, what's going on with this disaffiliation with the church? And a lot of us would describe it as a crisis of belief, that Christianity is asking us to believe in a lot of things, a lot of supernatural things, invisible things. And so we're having this crisis of belief. But I like the word enchantment, and that's a sociological term that has been popularized by the philosopher Charles Taylor, who wrote a very big book called A Secular Age. And he's the one that kind of put that word on a lot of people's radar screens. But I like enchantment because if we're dealing with a crisis of belief, then we just can't look at a culture and scream at it and say, believe these things that you find unbelievable. But enchantment, to your point, points to our experiences with the world and an openness to be surprised and maybe think that there is something under the toadstool, right? With like a little elf or a fairy, right? There is something about enchantment that suggests that the world might be a little bit more surprising and can maybe interrupt us in ways kind of that of a skeptical, materialistic view kind of shuts down or closes down. So there is this, I think, longing in us for the world to be magical, as your journey is an example of that. And so we are. So that's one of the things I'd also say about this, is that sometimes we tell the story that we're just going from belief to unbelief. And that's true. We are seeing a rise in kind of rates of atheism and agnosticism. But that's only around 20 to 25% of the population. Still, much of the world is very much enchanted. So another way to think about what's going on is that there is a shifting of enchantments, where people are kind of opting out of a traditional religious monotheistic enchantment for something that is a little bit more imminent. And so we are seeing a rise in like neo-pagan enchantments in our culture as well. So it's a mixed and diverse spiritual marketplace right now.
Yeah, there was a Pew study that came out just a couple weeks ago that was reflecting on the spiritual state of the nuns, the NONES people, who would not identify as being part of any kind of religious tradition. But this study was suggesting that although they may not want to align with some kind of institutional or formalized religious tradition, they still very much express belief in a higher power. And so that there's still this need, or, well, you call it an ache within us to connect with something beyond ourselves like that. It's still there within our culture.
Yeah. So some people describe this as the myth of disenchantment, that we are not as disenchanted as we think. And that you've asked, most people are supernaturalists. Most people believe they have a soul. They might believe in reincarnation. They might believe in karma. They believe that their loved ones look over and watch over them after they've passed on. And so, yes, I do think that it's pointing to what I might call a disenchantment with disenchantment, a dissatisfaction with a purely materialistic view of the world that kind of evacuates the world of kind of sacred significance.
Yeah. You also brought up how in the religious world, at least here in the Western Christian church, we're shrinking. I'm part of one of those shrinking denominations. And we hear a lot tossed around in our folds and enclaves and meetings that people just don't have a desire for God anymore. Mm-hmm. And yet what you're leaning into is that, no, people still do have this desire for God, that holy ache. How do you see people expressing a desire for God in our culture?
Yeah, I would say two things. I think one of the things that has created a loss of or disaffiliation in like mainline contexts is what I describe in this book as the mystical to moral shift. I think people now focus on being good people, loving people, kind, tolerant people, and in many ways our politics have increasingly become the repository of those values and that pursuit of goodness. The trouble, though, is that when goodness, and we all have our different visions of goodness. So for my social justice activistic students, that's, that being inclusive, seeking racial and gender justice, those goals become the how I pursue God in the world, seeking those political ends. And then the next question that gets asked in that conversation is deeply destabilizing. And that is, does one need God to be good? I tell a story in the new paperback version of my book about visiting with a ministry major at my school. So planning on going into the church, but he had a vocational crisis, and it was as simple as this. He said, Dr. Beck, some of the most loving people I know of my friends are atheists. And just that simple, existence of loving atheists. And he said, and some of my atheist friends are more loving than many of the Christians I know. And that simple moral comparison called his entire vocation into question. Like, and his, you'll see it there, right? If being good is the goal and church is either not necessary or even getting in the way, then why mess with it? And so I do think that's part of what's going on. Is I would describe it as the moralization or the politicization of faith. So where are we still longing for enchantment then if it's not in morals? I do think, as you've pointed out, that we are seeing it in what I describe as the ache, where there is a sense of existential restlessness. Increasingly, we're talking about a crisis of meaning among our young people. So in many ways, I think the conversation about God kind of begins with that restlessness, with our mental health crisis, with the free-floating anxiety out there, with the increasing anger of our kind of zero-sum fights over politics, that I do think people are dissatisfied and they don't know how to name that ache properly, perhaps, as a longing for transcendence. But positive psychology has been pointing us towards things like awe and gratitude and cosmic significance and meaning in life now for like 20 years. So I think kind of front porch back into a conversation about enchantment isn't going to be about politics or morality, seeking justice, as important as those things are, but maybe beginning the conversation more with the unease that we're all feeling in our culture.
Okay. You talked about a sense of awe, and I'm wondering how that takes shape in expressing the need for awe within our culture. Besides looking, I'm having trouble like imagining that. Besides just looking at like natural happenings, right? So the Grand Canyon certainly inspires a sense of awe. Are there ways that you see that people are inspiring a spiritual sense of awe?
Mm-hmm. I guess one of the more surprising findings from the science of awe is that natural beauty is not the leading trigger for awe.
Right.
Because I think that's where we go, and I do think
Right,
there's a I do think there's a problem for that about that. Because one of my concerns, and I talk about this in the book, is that when we associate awe with natural beauty, a kind of economic privilege starts to sneak in there, right? People that can get off to the spiritual retreat, people that can get to the mountains or get to the oceans. You have to have some sort of economic capacity to put yourself in these beautiful spaces. So I am a little bit worried about people who say, you know, where I experience God is on the ski vacation in Colorado. I agree.
Yeah.
But I agree. I do too. Or I experience awe when I'm, you know, at that beach vacation. I agree. Like, those are amazing things. But I do have a worry about the way that kind of leaves behind people in situations that are less captivating than those of us that can afford these kind of spiritual retreat experiences. So I do think we have to be intentional in recovering awe in the small, intimate spaces and the drudgery of everyday life. I love those books from Rabbit Room Press, Every Moment Holy. Your readers might know those books.
Yeah,
I think
we had the author on a past episode. Yep.
Yeah, I think that is a good resource for how to recover awe and the sacred in mundane spaces. But it's got to be a practice. It's got to be a liturgy that we do. We won't see that sacred thing if we're on our kind of default setting, which for a lot of us is kind of a God evacuated assumption. We move into the day presuming God isn't present. And I think we got to really work on that perceptual shift in ourselves. Anyway, but back to the point. In fact, I kind of lost the thread here. What was the earlier point?
Well, really, I was looking for ways that we do cultivate that sense of awe, besides out of like the strange, wonderful natural occurrence.
Yeah, and so I got it now. I remember what I was going to say. That natural beauty isn't the number one trigger. The number one trigger of awe is moral beauty, bearing witness to sacrificial acts of love and kindness. Moral beauty, when psychologists look at it, is more likely to trigger awe. And so I think putting ourselves in places where we can behold moral beauty is a place where we can cultivate awe that doesn't involve like going on a beach vacation. And so the awe of loving community, I think, is an important place to put ourselves. And so we can look at our neighborhoods and we can show up at places where good things are being done and bear witness to those acts of kindness. And psychologists know that doing good or being a part of a good activity gives you a feeling of positive affect that is more durable and gives you a longer lasting glow than just binging on a Netflix show. So that's one way we can do it, is kind of put ourselves where we are beholding or participating in acts of moral beauty.
If one of your students were to come to you asking for, I guess some recommend is a weird question, but if they were asking for some recommendations on how they might encounter that kind of moral beauty, where might you recommend they go?
Well, the local church. That might be a bit of a shock, but
Gasp.
But one of the things that I kind of talk to my students about joining a small and healthy local church, I think it's one of the best kept secrets on social media right now, is how if you just are a member of a small, local, healthy little church, you will every week bump into moral beauty. And pastors know this, and people that are faithful followers of Christ in churches. I mean, you know, it's a good example of this. My wife and I talked about this the other day, is like the works of Anne Lamott. Anne Lamott is a part of a mainline little church, and she's been journeying with that church. And she just tells in her normal day of just walking alongside that church about the beautiful things she encounters. I mean, she's a great guide on that work from that progressive mainline perspective. And as a member of my own local church, like, I bump into people all the time that are doing these just amazing things, just little acts of fidelity and care for taking the people in their lives. And if you're on social media, if you're looking at the church through a social media feed, you see none of that. All you see is the horrible things. And there are horrible things. But the little stories of the unnamed and unknown people, you'll never see those unless you just show up regularly and spend time in those spaces. So that might be a really weird recommendation, but I point my students to find a healthy, intimate community of faith and spend time, join a ministry, teach Sunday school, work in the food pantry, drive. Like one of the things I do at my church is I drive the handicap van, so I pick up our neighbors and I pick them up. And I tell you what, man, I get more fulfillment and more blessed out of that ministry than I can even describe. The other thing I would say to my students is show up. And I also say this for a lot of my friends, because I'm in an academic space, a lot of deconstructing academics. We critically pick at everything related to faith.
Yeah. The skeptical mind. Yeah.
Yeah. And I tell them, they ask me about like, what was really important in your own season of reconstruction of your faith? And I said, worshiping among the poor. If you show up with economically marginalized communities and worship in those spaces, those are enchanted spaces. God is real and alive and the Spirit is moving. But if you spend your time in critical intellectual spaces, you're always in like your cognitive analytical mode. You got to get in a place where you're around people that take the presence of God as a default. And so that was also important to me, is spending time with a little mission church in my town that had kind of a little bit of a charismatic vibe, really uncomfortable for me. But they enchanted my faith in many ways. So those are some things I would say, is like show up on the margins of society because God's real there. In privileged spaces and wealthy, educated spaces, it's pretty disenchanted. But if you move to the margins of your town or global Christianity, you're going to be back in a very enchanted space.
Yeah. There's this strange dichotomy that seems to be coming out where we want to recognize that God is everywhere. And that's part of the enchantment that we feel when we do recognize that, as you noted with the Every Moment Holy Book. I mean, there are liturgies in there for taking out the trash and making morning coffee. It's this sense that God is everywhere. And yet we also want to look for these spaces where we feel like the veil is thin, where God's presence is easily recognizable. So are there certain locations within your own everyday life where you feel like that veil is thin, where God's presence is easily recognizable for you?
Yeah, I think one of the blessings in my life, speaking of natural beauty, but something that's local, is that I'm a bike rider. I ride my bike to work, and it is either providential or lucky, depending on your metaphysics, that my bike ride is directly into the sunrise every morning. And so I get to see that going to work every day. Every day I'm outside looking at the rising sun. And that's always been a thin space for me, that kind of 20-minute watching the sunrise, getting my head clear, thinking about the day of work, thinking about my students and my colleagues, my family. It's a very prayerful time. So to me, that beginning of the day is like really, really important for me as well. But I've also taken care to kind of like create thin spaces in my own life. I talk in my book about taking a cue from liturgical and Catholic traditions where like material reminders, use of icons, and statues and prayer beads and things. So my office is, my students call it the chapel, because it is stuffed with reminders of God, and they would like just to be in that space to visit with me or talk with me. So that space for me is kind of like an oasis. The way I've curated my physical surroundings to bring me into kind of a more intentional experience of God. So those are two things. I mean, other than experiences, right? So experiences of, I pray before my classes and morning coffee with my wife. I mean, there's lots of different enchantments in my day that I could name.
What's one of your favorite relics, so to speak, one of your favorite physical representations that you keep in your office?
I have so Therese of Lisieux, I wrote another book called Stranger God, and she is a Catholic saint who's known in the Catholic tradition for a spiritual practice she calls the little way. And in many ways, I had become like a practitioner of the little way in my own life. And I tell that story in a different book about small acts of kindness and care and seeing others in front of you. And so I have in my office this old statue of her. It's kind of chipped and got patina on it. And that's like one of my favorite things, because she becomes, for me, when I see that statue, and it's right across from where I sit in my office, of learning to see the sacred presence of the person like standing right in front of me. Because to me, ultimately, that has to be our thin space. The thin space has to be the person standing right in front of me, and fighting for that sacred recognition in the midst of my hurry and my irritation or my schedule. So that would be like, if I had if my office was burning down, I'd probably grab that statue first, out of that space.
Well, in thinking about young people, this is going to flip our model a little bit, where we're talking about what they need and expect in terms of spirituality. But often within the church, we hear leaders expressing a want to connect with young people. So as you sit observing kind of their deepest needs, what are some ways that the church might respond to what they're doing? What story does the church need to tell in order to be a stronger presence amidst the young people who you work with?
So I would say a couple things. One is, I think a lot of mainline churches have made the mistake of continually unpacking Christianity in justice and moral terms, because the idea is young people care about justice, they're social justice warriors, so we're going to keep unpacking the gospel in the idiom of which they're passionate about. My argument is you're participating in the unwittingly the disenchantment of the younger generation. The social justice move is actually hurting you, because, as I said, they will then ask the next question, well, do I need to show up at your space on a Sunday morning or participate in your community to vote well in this next election, to march in the next protest? And the answer is no, they don't. So I would suggest, first of all, to keep Christianity weird. Okay.
Love it. Okay.
like
Let's
don't
talk. Yeah.
I think pastors in mainline traditions have so unpacked this worldly political implications of the gospel, as they must. I want to be clear about this, absolutely clear, as they must. But they evacuate Christianity of its weirder, spookier, magical aspects, and thus we let our young people go find those enchantments elsewhere. And so they drift into neo-pagan kinds of things, or they dabble with tarot cards, or they start following their horoscopes. Like, they're looking for enchantment, and we're not giving it to them, because we're just, every Sunday morning, it's like, gender justice, sexuality justice, racial justice, justice. They can get that anywhere. So keep Christianity weird is the first thing I would say. And the second thing I would say is lean into the ache. Like we keep putting justice out in front of our like, follow Jesus because of the, he's like the social justice warrior par excellence. But the one thing that we're not doing enough for their young people is paying attention to their anxiety. Like, lean into the fact that they are aching for transcendence, and we're not giving them transcendence. We're giving them activism. And so speak about their need, about a sacred grounding that grounds their identity, it grounds their mental health. So back to our conversation about things like awe and gratitude and meaning in life. When I talk about anxiety, like when I look at my students and say, don't you guys feel really unsettled, that when you peer into yourself, there's just this great instability, and they get quiet. And so I would suggest pastors push on that ache a little bit to evoke a desire or a thirst or a hunger to fill that void, because our young people, I think, are suffering from a lack of transcendence. So those are two things: keep Christianity weird and lean into the ache for transcendence with young people.
And I think that leaning into the ache, that's not really a marketing tactic. I think it's a contemplative tactic. It's asking people into a space where they're reflecting on what it is that they really need within their lives, which I think is important to note, because otherwise it may seem manipulative.
Yeah, that's true. And I get that criticism, and I get that sometimes because people are concerned, like, is God then just become a Band-Aid for my needs and my mental health kinds of things? And so I agree that we shouldn't get out there and evoke that to get a response or whatever. But I would just go back to something Augustine said, right? Our hearts are restless until they rest in God. And that is an ancient observation. I've had some people suggest, like, is this a modern thing? Like, no, our hearts have been restless. Without God, just from an ontological perspective, we are finite creatures standing over an abyss of nothingness. And without some sort of sacred dependency, we kind of sense that about ourselves. And so our ontological instability, right, our lack of grounding in the real, means we are left to kind of conjure up for ourselves our own existence. But we can't do that very well because of our finitude and our fragility. So I do think we're calling people to a rest that is elusive now.
Well, for our friend who's listening, who is in that place of deconstruction and maybe caught in this space, as you were talking about, where it's in the intellectual and skeptical loop, what might be just a first step to encounter a sense of awe, to interrupt or disrupt that loop of skepticism and intellectualism?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in the book, I go through what I call enchanted Christianities. I look at liturgical, contemplative resources like you've mentioned, like practicing the presence of God, the liturgies of every moment holy. I talk about charismatic enchantments. That was the most triggering chapter for some of my friends. But one of the resources in charismatic traditions is an emphasis on affectivity, allowing our hearts to be recaptured and focused on. And the other thing that I think is important from charismatic traditions is their focus on testimony or storytelling. I've had churches that are trying to practice some of the ideas in the book. And one of the most powerful things that pastors have said is that when I got a small group together and I tell them to tell their stories of enchantment, like, when did you feel the presence of God? Like, what was your conversion story? And a lot of those for us, those are decades in the rearview mirror. But it was healing and helpful for them to just remind themselves of when that felt real to them. And it was helpful for them to hear the stories of other people to kind of bring God back into a view again. So the power of sharing our stories of enchantment, because in many ways I think enchantment is a discipline of memory in many ways. And then lastly, I turned to Celtic enchantments, resources like natural beauty, but poetry. The Celtic Christians felt that the poets were the ones that communicated the insights of the Holy Spirit. So for some of us, we lean into poetry as a way to kind of recover kind of a sacramental vision of the world. So I've had students of mine write poetry to fight against the default materialism of their day, because that's the one thing poetry teaches you, is to read a mundane moment as meaningful. As stuffed with meaning, even if it's just sitting on a bench waiting for a subway train. That, through the eyes of poetry, that moment can become holy ground, the gateway of heaven. So that might not be a normal tool, but I would suggest, like, getting people in your churches to read or write poetry. But lastly, the thing I would say, taking a cue from a moment in the book of Acts, where Paul is asked in the book of Acts to share one of the very first sermons with a pagan audience. And they don't know the stories of ancient Israel. And so he speaks for the first time about how to bring God into view amongst a group of people that have never laid eyes on this God. In their own minds, they don't think they have. And he says, we come to proclaim the God who made the heavens and the earth. So he points to natural beauty. But what I talk about in the book is at the very end, he says, the God that brings you food and harvests and then fills your heart with joy. And I love how Paul's first gospel message to a wholly unchurched, to use that language, audience was joy. And so, right, not the stories of the Old Testament, but he pointed to their joy and he said, this God has not left himself without a witness. So the one thing I would say to the disenchanted people is I think a lot of people are like waiting for like a voice from heaven. They're waiting for an audible voice from heaven. They want to behold a miracle. But I would suggest that God is not ever left himself without a witness, and he's speaking. And so my last bit of advice is like, widen the bandwidth for what counts as an encounter with God. And if things like moments of fleeting joy, being interrupted by joy, like on my bike ride to work, is to not just move past those moments, but dwell upon the communication that is occurring there, and to not just blow past it as like a trick of the mind, but suggest that God has been speaking to you his entire life, our entire lives.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being part of our Compass community. We look forward to continuing to explore spirituality in the everyday with you. You might want to listen to another episode of Compass. It's highly encouraged. So a great follow-up to this episode with Richard Beck might be episode 120, Discovering Evidence of the Divine. It gives some framework for dealing with tough questions of faith. Episode 93, about experiencing God in nature with Victoria Loures. That would be a great follow-up to this episode as well. So a couple good ones to follow up this listen. And again, while you're listening, leave that rating and or review. Really appreciate it. The Compass Podcast is brought to you by United Methodist Communications. And that's it for this week. We're going to be back with another episode in 2 weeks' time, so I will chat at you then. My name is Ryan Dunn, and I wish you peace.